Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is our partner webinar with our friends at AvePoint. We're talking about AvePoint Opus, which is primarily around managing the life cycle of our content in terms of archiving. I've got Lauren joining us. Lauren is our, oops, I've got my slides in the wrong order, so I might just go that way. We've got Lauren joining us. Lauren is our partner development manager from AvePoint, who's been helping us get set up with AvePoint. We already do their backup solutions and some of their archiving solutions. And we've got Eric, who's going to be doing the demos today. And Eric's got lots of experience in the AvePoint Opus product. And so he's going to be here to give us a run through of the features of the product and also to answer any questions that you might have as we're going through. Everyone knows us, we're Stratos, so there's a little slide here just to tell you about us anyway, in case you didn't realise that we do SharePoint and Teams and Power Platform stuff. So if you'd like to know more, you can always have a chat to Mel. So the format of today will be in our webinar format, so just pop your questions into the chat as we're going. We'll moderate the questions, and and as we're going, trying to either answer them as we go, and we'll also have hopefully a bit of time at the end for a Q&A as well. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing and hand over to Eric.
I will share my screen, if it lets me. Here we go. Okay, so we're talking about storage optimization in M365 today. So I guess just starting off, a couple scary stats here on the screen. M365 adoption rates are still growing. As organizations continue to mature in M365, that cloud storage is growing with them exponentially. So just some scary stats here, seeing something like a 23% year-on-year data growth in M365 on average. Anyone using Copilot as well is seeing that ramp up even quicker. And what we see is that most organizations do not really have a strategy in place to optimize that data storage. And when you get that lean 1 terabyte and 10 gigs of 10 additional gigs per user of pooled storage, it doesn't take long before that additional storage is needed. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but SharePoint is actually one of the most expensive cloud storage options in the world. So a few things that we've been hearing is that basically, again, most organizations, they don't have any sort of real storage optimization strategy in place. And then more and more are starting to exceed those default M365 storage limits, eventually leading to some huge unexpected overage fees. And it's kind of hard to really understand where to even begin to address that out of control data growth. In addition to this, regulatory retention and disposal requirements aren't necessarily being properly addressed, just as well as employees wasting significant amounts of time finding the right information they need, sifting through redundant, obsolete, trivial data that still exists in the tenant from legacy days or maybe just isn't needed anymore. We do hear some stories of people trying to tackle this storage challenge on their own, potentially going in, manually deleting or archiving data based on just what they think they might or might not need, and then ending up eventually creating even bigger headaches and issues for those end users trying to do their job, but can't find that document that's been removed somehow, and then ultimately creating big headaches for IT teams as well, trying to shuffle to restore things. This effectively summarizes some of the challenges that AvePoint set out to solve when they created Opus. So hopefully some of this resonates with you on the call here today. And typically what we see is that big storage costs is a major driver for someone that pushes someone to actually start looking for a solution. But it's definitely not the only criteria that needs to be addressed when solving for this problem. It doesn't make sense to start down this route and then end up creating even more headaches and hassles for us. Even if we do save a bit of money. So it needs to be an effective solution. So just to go through a sort of quick overview of Opus. So starting off, you've got all your M365 data content sources. So your SharePoint, your Teams, your OneDrive. And what we want to do first is really break down and analyze that data, get some basic information that will basically dictate what sort of rules would make sense to implement. So I will go into a little bit more detail as to what those reports would look like and how we do decide on some rules, but ultimately we want to create rules that maximize the amount of storage saving gains that we can get, but really minimize the impact on any of the end users just trying to go about their day-to-day jobs. So essentially what we would do is we'd create these rules, and then Opus would be, moving that into cheaper archived storage. But then in order to prevent that end user disruption, we actually have two options to go down to restore that data back again. So the first is that stub file placeholders. So what we can do is, in place of any document that gets archived, we can replace it with a stub file. It basically sits there as a placeholder that users, they might, they expect to see some sort of document there, and they see it's been archived now. What they'll be able to do is they'll be able to see that stub file in its place, and they'll be able to restore from that link there. I will show you a little bit more at what that process actually looks like in a moment, but that's the first option to be able to get back that data that's been archived. The other option is we have a recenter portal. So this is essentially a portal where those users themselves, staff, can actually go in and search through things. So obviously this is going to be security trimmed so that they'll have to be the owner of this document or things from their own OneDrive if they're going to be able to restore. But basically they can go in here as well and search for that document they need and restore it back. Typically, this isn't something we see people look to tackle straight away, but eventually down the line, as that archive data looks to build up as well, we could potentially be looking to implement some strategies to also purge data from archive as well, based on a certain sets of rules and criteria. So hopefully that makes sense as to sort of a quick overview of how we go about storage optimization, but I will be sort of breaking this down a little bit more in a moment. So in terms of where the data is actually going to be hosted in archive, we host our data in 14 Azure data centers globally. You do have flexibility on which one of these locations you want to choose in, but being an Australian customer, we do recommend going with Australia Southeast for data residency reasons. I mean, at a high level, security, high availability, 24/7 support, data sovereignty, these are some of the highest priorities for AvePoint. If there is a popular security standard or certification that exists in market, then we almost certainly have it. We are an extremely enterprise-focused organization as well. We have some very big customers, NASA, some large defense contracts. So we definitely take this extremely seriously when it comes to handling customer data.
Eric, I've just got a question from Jeremy. So the question is about the stub file and whether it retains the original file extension and metadata of the file, but are we going to go through that in the demo that we do?
Yeah, so I do have a slide coming up that talks a little bit more about the stub files, but to answer your question directly, yes, absolutely, we retain all that information. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Cool. So if there is any sort of concerns or questions around data security, definitely let us know in the chat. We can absolutely share some documentation around our certs and how we get qualified and rated and how we handle data and encrypt it and things like that, if that is a concern. So jumping into some of the UI now. So as mentioned, the first step is really getting a better understanding of your data so that we can actually understand what sort of rules would make the most sense to implement in terms of those automated archiving rules. So starting with something that we call a ROT analysis. So this is where we can break down redundant, outdated, and trivial data. So we're going to get sort of breakdowns here on things like, well, firstly, total size of the environment, and then total size of that ROT data, and a breakdown of what that ROT data actually comprises of. So some examples we have here is things like 50, let me tick that through, things like maybe files that have over 50 versions saved, or maybe you want to change that down to just keeping 20 versions. It's probably unlikely that you need to go back in version history more than 20. But if you did, that's something then we could make a rule to archive based on, let's say, let's keep the latest 10, 20 versions in SharePoint, and then we'll move those additional versions out. So that's one example. Old executable files, unsupported file extensions, duplicate data, data that hasn't been modified in over 3 years. So these are sorts of examples that we might create rules based on what we see in here. So for example, if one of these fields was to pick up and say that, we have a whole ton of documents that haven't been edited at all or modified in over 3 years, and we drill into that and we see that there's a bunch of, say, PowerPoint documents. PowerPoint documents is a great example of something that when it doesn't get edited for a couple of years, it's unlikely that we're going to be still using it. We don't really want to be presenting on data that's very old. On the flip side, we might have lots of PDFs that haven't been edited in 3 years, and it's unlikely that we do a lot of editing once something is created as a PDF, but it is still likely that we need those PDFs. So we might not want to create a rule that includes something like a PDF based on that modified time. So hopefully that gives you some sort of sense as to like how we can break down the data a bit further. We also have a few other tabs here. So inactive optimization tab. This is more around creating rules based specifically on those last modified, the inactive time of those documents. So again, getting breakdowns on things like what does the data look like that hasn't been modified in over 3 years? Are there any sort of extension types or files or maybe sites or folders that have extreme amounts of data that's old? And then we can potentially make some sophisticated archiving rules based off of that data to make sure that we're targeting really the best data. So just again, we want to make rules that maximize how much storage we save, but we don't want to be including things that it's likely that users might need to do their jobs on a day-to-day, even though we have these back-end restore processes that we can get the data back if we were to accidentally archive some data that we needed. It's still best to avoid that in the first place. With also this progress tab, this is where we can sort of make some projections around our existing growth in our storage growth in our environment. And then we can put in our storage costs here, and then we can figure out, okay, at this current rate, how much increase in spending are we expecting over time? And then we can look at these trends as to what sort of our archiving looks like and how much we can potentially save over time as well. Cool. So when it comes to creating these rules, the good thing about the rules is we don't have to just apply them across our entire environment all at once. You might have certain folders or sites that contain very sensitive data, maybe some HR data or something like that, and you want to completely exclude them from your rules. Or you might have rules that make sense to broadly apply everywhere, but then some more targeted rules to just apply to individual sites or individual folders. So you can get very granular where you want to include those rules and where you want to completely exclude those rules. Setting up the rules themselves, pretty straightforward. I'd say that really the challenge when it comes to an archiving project is figuring out, what sort of rules make the most sense. And that's where the team here is going to be really good to help you sort of figure out. The Stratos team is going to help you figure out what makes most sense and make sure you get this right. But creating the rules themselves, what we do is we want to create layered rules. So things like, as an example here, all the following conditions must be true. Let's take these DWG, so CAD files that were created over 7 years ago and last modified over 3 years ago. We're going to move them into archive, but also leave behind that stub file with those restore options so we can get it back again should we need to. So once we have set up these rules, again, we can apply them to wherever we need to, or we can also run something called a simulation job. So a simulation job, basically, we take these rules and we see, before we actually run them on the live environment, we can just have a quick look at sort of like a sanity check to see if we were to run those rules that we think make sense on these sites, it would pick up this many files, this much data, and we can actually get a breakdown of, the individual files, just to make sure that, that last final sanity check. So in this example here, if I'd run these rules on these sites, it would have picked up 680 files totaling 420 megabytes. Once we're ready to implement these rules, we set up a recurring job schedule. This is something we typically see run just on a monthly basis. It's not something we need running, multiple times a day, every day. It's just once a month we rerun these rules, and it picks up any additional data that now meets our archiving criteria and moves it into that archive storage. Okay, so the stub file and user experience. So this here is an example in SharePoint of a document that's met one of our criteria for one of our archiving rules. Let's just say it was created over 5 years ago, hasn't been modified in over 3 years. This is probably going to be a good example of a document that can be moved into archive storage. So what's going to happen here is that set of archiving rules is going to run. This document's going to get flagged. It's going to get picked up, moved to that archive storage, and it's going to be replaced with a stub file. So the stub file, it'll sit in the place of this document. It's got the same name. It's just got .url at the end. All the other associated metadata is the same, except obviously it's a very small file size now instead. But things like last modified dates, last modified by, ownership, permission structure, everything else remains the same, and it just sits there in SharePoint ready, so that if a user comes into here, they expect to see this this Word document here, but they're now met with this this document instead. So that user will be able to click that link. They'll get brought to this one-click restore page. Using their Microsoft single sign-in credentials, they'll then, if they were actually an owner of this document originally, they will now have the permissions to restore this or download it. And then that will give them a little progress bar. Once finished, they'll be able to hit take me back, and that will take them back here, and that document will now be back. So the idea here is that, we want to be able to implement an archive storage solution that effectively is reducing costs and helps us manage our storage long term, but also doesn't remove the ability for anyone to do their job, because it is likely that when we start archiving things, we will eventually run into the situation that something is archived that shouldn't have been. So hopefully that gives you some peace of mind as to how we would approach that situation should that happen. Hopefully, Jeremy, that answers some of your questions. Absolutely, the metadata is kept. So we're extremely dedicated to maintaining metadata here at AvePoint. We don't want to be changing anything, even upon restoring. Nothing in the permissions, nothing in the created dates, modified dates is going to change at all. It's not going to be updated with new times or anything like that. We're going to be maintaining that metadata integrity.
Eric, we have a question. So the question's from Janet. The question is, if the stub file is restored, what conditions could exist that to ensure it goes back to storage automatically? So if we're restoring, we've got the original modified by dates and so on that file, and the rule had that modified. We'll keep the original modified, right? So the next time we run, it would re-archive in that scenario.
Yeah, so it sort of depends on how you've set up those rules. So I guess if you were to restore something and then nothing about that document that got it originally picked up by our archiving rules is changed. So let's say we have a rule that's based on modified dates and created dates in a certain folder. If that document gets restored and we don't modify it or do anything to it, it will get picked up in the next round of archiving again for sure. If we want to avoid something like that, we could implement a rule that says let's not archive anything that was accessed in the past 3 months, something like that. So we can put in some sort of ways around, not re-archiving immediately, but yeah, essentially, it just really depends on how you want to approach that situation.
Thank you.
No worries. So every now and then we get the question, how does backup differ to archiving? Does archiving replace the need for backup? Does backup potentially replace the need for archiving? Well, I guess first off, I hope everyone here is backing up their M365 data, as well as any other locations that contains critical business data. In 2025, we really see backup as non-negotiable. Pretty much every single cybersecurity framework in the market has backup as a core requirement, especially or including Australian Essential 8 framework. It's also an expectation that Microsoft themselves have under their shared responsibility model. Microsoft recommends that you back up your data so that you can recover quickly from a security incident. but also because Microsoft does not accept liability if they were to lose any of your data, which absolutely could happen and does happen. The entire point of backup really is just that you have data stored in at least 2 locations, so that if anything was to happen to one of the sets of data, you could recover from the other. So today, my assumption here is that most of your business data exists in SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, somewhere in M365, and hopefully you've got a copy of that data somewhere in a cloud backup solution. With Opus archiving, that primary business data is now split up into 2 locations. Primary data that you would be using on a day-to-day basis is still going to be in SharePoint and M365, and then that redundant, obsolete, trivial data that we have is now effectively going to be moved into Opus. It's not going to now have 2 locations. We don't want to keep it in SharePoint and in Opus. It's just either going to be now your primary data in SharePoint, that redundant, obsolete, trivial in Opus. So without any sort of backups in place, this is really only going to be 1 copy. So this is why we would need to still have that backup in place to make sure that we have duplicate copies of everything. So I guess just to sort of summarize again, backup, it's there to make sure we've got 2 copies of our data, but backup does not solve the problem of growing storage costs. Backup will not be automatically deleting or removing things out of SharePoint. It's not going to be putting in this ability to restore very easily, and that rot data is essentially going to keep filling up. On the other hand, archiving, it can help you cut down these storage costs by moving that rot data out of M365, still giving us that easy restore functionality, but it does not create additional backups of the data. So you will need both backup and automated archiving to both reduce storage costs while staying protected.
Eric, so I've got a document. My document has been archived. Is the archive itself backed up?
So how we do that is we recommend that you're running daily, hopefully multiple times a day, backups of your SharePoint environment, so that anything that exists in SharePoint gets copied, and that way, by the time we set up a rule to move it out in Opus, it's already been captured in your backups, and then it gets moved out. So we don't actually take backup copies of the Opus data. I mean, the Opus data, it should be very safe. I can't think of any time in history that we've lost data in Opus or that that data gets corrupted or anything. That being said, definitely make sure that backups schedules are being run daily in the live environment, and that gets copied before it gets moved out into Opus.
So the backup retention policy on the backup itself would be important from that point of view. But once an item is moved into the archive, the backup size should actually reduce going forward, right? Because it's now just the stub.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask. I was told that some of you here might be interested to understand how Opus interacts with M365 retention policies and retention labels. So obviously, if you're using Purview in M365, a couple of thumbs up. So if you are using Purview in M365, we can apply these retention labels to documents to restrict the ability for anyone to be able to delete that data during those set retention periods. We can also obviously set site or even tenant-wide M365 retention policies designed to ensure that any data that is deleted gets moved to that preservation hold library instead of actually being deleted. One of the issues with using a preservation hold library is that when data is deleted, we don't see a drop in our storage growth or our storage consumption. So to sort of answer, how does this interact with Opus? So, well, first off, when we run these Opus archiving rules, firstly, a document that meets our archiving rule, it'll first be copied into archive, but then we do need to remove it from storage, from SharePoint rather, to get that storage savings and to actually get that rot data cleanup benefit. So firstly, rules can be enabled to automatically remove a retention label so that we can move it to SharePoint, move it to Opus and then remove it from SharePoint. So that's the first part of it. The second part is that we can also configure retention settings in Opus to decide how long to keep the data in archive. So Opus will effectively be able to replace this retention or mirror any sort of retention requirements. If you do need to keep data for 7 years, we can still archive it in Opus and then designate to keep it for 7 years. And additionally, our backup as well. If you store data in backup with us, we have retention policy settings there as well for how long you want us to keep the data. However, if there are environment or site level retention policies set so that data gets moved into preservation hold library, that means even if we were to remove those retention labels and delete data from SharePoint, we're not going to be seeing storage benefits because that preservation library is going to be holding the files. So I just have a quick workflow for how we approach anyone that's using these existing purview retention settings and effectively that preservation hold library. I'll address your question, Jeremy, in a moment. I'm just going to go through this slide. Hopefully by the end of it, might answer your question. I'm not too sure. But essentially, just for a quick workflow overview of how we approach dealing with existing purview retention policies. Step 1, we want to back up the entire existing M365 environment, including that preservation hold library, so that we have everything backed up and a copy of everything that exists in the tenant today. That way, if anything should happen to any data, we've got that backed up somewhere and we can always recover from that. That is something that AvePoint can do. Not a lot of vendors do allow for backing up the preservation hold library, but it's absolutely something that AvePoint can do as a service. So if that's something you want to do, definitely reach out to the team. So now that we have a redundant copy of all of our data, so that we're effectively safe if anything should happen, the next step would be to actually turn off those M365 retention policies. From here, we could consider to restore from that preservation hold library back into SharePoint, and then we can run these archiving rules to then move that redundant data out again if we wanted to. There's multiple ways that we could go about this. We could simply move all that data into a folder back into SharePoint from the preservation hold library. We might call this restored preservation hold library data, and then create a rule that says move everything from that folder back into SharePoint again, back into archive storage with Opus again, so that we don't have to keep it back in that live environment. From here, we'd be archiving the redundant, obsolete, trivial data in the tenant into that cheaper archive storage, probably including that PHL data, and then removing it from SharePoint. So at this point, all of your data now either exists in SharePoint or it exists in the archive storage, and an additional copy backed up in that third-party backup. Nothing in the preservation hold library anymore, and we're going to see that storage drop. From there, we continue our ongoing archiving, and any of that data that gets flagged in the future by our archiving rules is going to be able to be moved straight into that Opus storage, as well as be backed up to retain that backup copy. And again, we can use in Opus and in backup, we can set those retention settings to determine how long we should hold that data for. Hopefully that makes a bit more sense as to how we sort of deal with those retention policies and label settings. If you do have any questions around that, feel free to ask. I see there is a question here by Jeremy. Does AvePoint allow the equivalent of a disposition manager review at the end of the retention period? Might have to, following this call, share some information more around how that process is. I'm not too familiar with that end of retention period process looks like, but I know that there is a whole bunch of sort of dashboards and reports that we can generate there, and we can sort of look into the approvals as to what that process of handling that data looks like at the end of its life. I just don't have anything in my slides or off the top of my head to present there.
Yeah, one thought, Eric, that I'd have on this is if we've got a purview retention policy that's applying to some content, at the end of that retention period, we can run a workflow. Mm-hmm. So one approach that could be taken is to use the retention policy to manage that inside SharePoint, and at the end of the retention period, use the workflow to trigger or update a value which triggers a rule for a rule within AvePoint to move it to long-term storage, because often at the end of the retention period, the decision is, do we delete or do we retain for as an archive for a long period of time? So that kind of approach would work, but I know Jeremy's scenario wouldn't work entirely for his. So what we're looking at more there is at the end of that retention period in AvePoint is does AvePoint then automatically remove the item at the end of its archive life, or does it have someone review and approve before it does? I think that's the question. So perhaps if we catch up afterwards on that one, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely try to dig up some information around that. Yep, Jeremy, was that sort of your question summarized there?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. Steve, you actually just sort of reminded me on a point as well when it comes to our rules. We can also create sort of a rule set to have the manual ability to designate things for the archive system. So we could create a rule that says, for example, let's archive everything in this specific folder. Or we can make a column in SharePoint, for example, called the archive column. And if anyone ticks the yes box on that column, then that item will get archived. So we can also, on top of these automated file level rules to just pick up things that meet criteria, we can also set up multiple different ways that we can, specifically say, I want to archive this document by dragging it in here or ticking this box. On the flip side, we can also create a column to say, do not archive, even if it does meet this criteria. So let's say we had, a set of documents that we think might, a whole folder that has sensitive data, and we just want to make sure that nothing in there gets archived. We can have a column that says archive, set that to no, and then even if any individual documents meet that criteria, it won't get moved. Gives us a bit of that sort of ability to get more hands-on and mark things for archive should we need to. That's pretty much all to me. I mean, I'd like to give a little bit more time back into your day. Really appreciate you listening to me. We hope that you saw some value in that session. We like showing Opus. It's something we see that sort of it's a solution where everyone wins, kind of like a win-win where you get to save on some storage costs and without actually impacting that end user experience.
Eric,
yep.
Maybe a quick question would be around obviously we've shown the individual file restore for the end user, but if we needed to do a bulk restore, is that also possible?
Yeah, so doing bulk restores with Opus?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the stub file process is going to be just for that day-to-day individual document. You're expecting to need a PDF or a PowerPoint, and then you see it's not there, but the stub file is. It's going to be that quick, easy way to restore that. If you did need to restore something in bulk, you've got the recenter portal, so that's where the end users themselves could go in and restore like an entire folder or whatever it is that they need to do. Or as an administrator, definitely reach out to the Stratos team if you have some sort of challenging situation or you're not sure what's going on. Reach out to them and they'll be able to restore on the site-wide level. Whereas an individual user, they're obviously only going to be able to restore their own documents. So if they need access to something that they're not the owner of, that's where you'll need to reach out to the team.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Jeremy about handling images and whether the stub can include a thumbnail.
So we definitely can archive images and replace them with stub files. Unfortunately, it won't include the image in the thumbnail anymore. We only keep the associated metadata, not the actual content-related data. So when it comes to doing like a search now in SharePoint for something, as an example, we can search in SharePoint for things like the name of the file, who's the owner, locations, all the normal typical associated metadata, but not in content data. That stub file doesn't have any data associated to the actual in content. So you couldn't do like a search for a phrase that comes within that file. And then, yeah, it won't include something like a thumbnail. So
are there any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, the Stratos team are here. We're also here, so definitely feel free to reach out. If there's anything you're still unsure about, let us know further down the line. I'm sure we can dig up some information for you as well.
So yeah, Eric, look, thank you very much for your time today presenting, and thanks for joining us, Lauren, as well. One of the things I really like about the AvePoint Opus, which is one of the reasons why we decided to do this webinar in particular, was around that ability. Like there's a lot of flexibility in the rules around how we can manage content. And I know that specifically for some organisations where they have to retain very long periods of time for information related to, say, projects or activities the organisation does, this gives us an option to do that while supporting search if we have custom metadata. So, for example, if we're using a modern search experience where we're filtering by project number and we've tagged the documents, then we can still find search and find in that kind of way, which is much better, I think, than any of the other solutions I've seen to this problem. And then also it's automated. So once you've set it up, it looks after itself, which is also great. So yeah, if anybody does have any questions, yeah, please follow up with Mel afterwards. The recording will be available as well. So if there's anything you want to go back to, and if you'd like a further demo or questions, please, again, let Mel know and we can arrange that also.